to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The day after this speech, on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was murdered in Memphis, Tennessee, on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel at the age of 39. Like Moses, he caught a glimpse of his promised land, but was unable to enter it himself. A world where every man and every woman would have their own place and dignity. A world at peace, where brotherly love would come first. Martin Luther King paid for this dream with his life. At a time when the struggle against racial segregation and civil rights was at its peak, he became the charismatic leader of Black Americans. And still today, King is an emblematic figure, inspiring many around the world who hunger for justice and freedom.
His death was a huge shock for America. And even the black people who criticized him would completely change their outlook. Because he was a man whose message was not fake. He was true to his word. He really gave up his life.
Before, the frame of mind was, you have to fight for everything. If you do not fight for everything, you will get nothing. Through the march, through Martin Luther King's teachings and everything, that is when we began to learn about nonviolence. And even today, I don't think violence is the answer.
Mais lui ne va jamais perdre de vue.
He always kept his eyes on the horizon. He saw a horizon where people live together and are not divided by ethnic, social, political, or cultural factors. His dream, or what I call his vision, is that of a reconciled world. A world where everyone recognizes the other as his brother.
The dream is far from being fulfilled. Regarding King's dream, some even say the dream is shattered, the dream is lost. Yet I believe it is still alive. Indeed, it's not possible in a few years to erase the wounds of 200 years of slavery of the black population. And just a few years of struggle cannot erase the traces left in people's memories and attitudes.
In the 17th century, shortly after the arrival of British settlers in America, the first black slaves arrived. They were imported from Africa like merchandise in inhumane conditions in order to fulfill the need for labor, particularly on the Virginia plantations. Despite the official abolition of slavery in 1865 throughout the United States, the vast majority of blacks in the southern states lived in poverty, were excluded from political life, and were victims of daily humiliation due to segregation. This situation continued until the 1950s.
There were lots and lots of racism. White people and black people did not go to church together. They did not go to school together. They did not socialize together. We could not go into the same door in a department store or anything. The white people went through one door, We go around the back and go through the other door. We were not allowed to drink water from the same water fountain.
Racial segregation was also part of the transportation system. According to the bylaws of the state of Alabama, the seats at the front of a bus were reserved for whites, while blacks were relegated to the rear of the vehicle. They could, however, use the central area as long as the seats were not needed by a white person. If a white person needed a seat, the blacks were obliged to either give up their seat and go to the seats assigned to them at the back, or step off the bus. December 1st, 1955 marked a turning point in the struggle for equality between blacks and whites. A black woman, Rosa Parks, boarded a bus and refused to give up her seat to a white man. She was quickly arrested and charged with public disorder as well as violating local laws.
She was arrested, and that's when a movement began to emerge, a movement which had already been quietly in the works. What is not so well known is that it was a group of women who were present at the birth of the movement. Indeed, some women approached the pastors, including Ralph Abernathy, who was a friend of King. Then Ralph Abernathy went to see Martin Luther King to get him to join the movement.
The Rosa Parks incident was the trigger that prompted a group of black men and women from Montgomery, Alabama, to imagine, propose, and organize a boycott that began on December 5th.
Actually, King was very young when they sought his help. Some people had noticed not only his abilities and intellectual capacity, but also his commitment. And with his involvement in the bus boycott, Martin Luther King emerged as a leader. He became the voice of the voiceless.
Martin Luther King Jr. was born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. He came from a family of Baptist pastors. Having an excellent academic background, he obtained a theology degree in Pennsylvania and a doctorate in theology from Boston University. In 1954, he became the pastor of a church in Montgomery, Alabama. The year before, he married Coretta Scott, a music student with whom he would have 4 children. Martin Luther King was marked by the legacy of the black church, in which black people identified with the Hebrews held in slavery in Egypt and welcomed the good news of a God who sets man free. During his studies, he became very interested in Mahatma Gandhi's ideas, including the use of nonviolence and civil resistance to obtain human rights. He would later use Gandhi's ideas in his struggle against the injustices and inequalities endured by black Americans.
It is worth mentioning that the height of civil rights struggle occurred at the end of the 1950s and throughout the 1960s. This really was not so long after Gandhi led actions for the liberation of India. Gandhi was assassinated in 1948, 20 years before Martin Luther King. And the Indian struggle left a deep impression in many parts of the world, particularly with those who were oppressed, and that includes part of the black American population. Later on, he would not forget Gandhi's principles, but he began to quote more and more from the Gospel. One of King's favorite passages was from Matthew chapter 5. The passage insisted on the love and forgiveness of one's enemies. Martin Luther King, who knew his congregation well, knew that these passages would speak to his listeners. He knew that, in the end, the gospel would be much more powerful than an example coming from elsewhere, such as India. And he found in the gospel, and especially in the testimony of Christ, all that he needed to provide the spiritual food for those engaged in the struggle.
King highlighted that it was the strategies that came from Gandhi. And in fact, King said, Gandhi finished the method, Christ the foundation.
I truly believe that not only could Martin Luther King not have been able to carry out the work he had to do if he had not been full of the presence of God, and if he had not had an inner vision of Jesus and his actions. But I also believe that the movement would not have been so successful, even with its share of painful setbacks, if all those who fought non-violently with Martin Luther King had not been full of this spirituality themselves.
One evening, when King returned home, he had an experience that strengthened his commitment.
Un soir de janvier 1956, King a assisté pour la
One evening in January 1956, for the umpteenth time, King attended and chaired one of these meetings where everyone was in need of renewed strength. By the time he got home, it was already late. Then in the middle of the night, the phone rang. King answered, and he heard a voice tell him that if he did not leave the city within 3 days, he could say goodbye to his wife and their child. King felt a rush of anxiety. He went to make himself a coffee, and he tried to sort everything out in his mind. At that moment, he turned to do something so simple and yet so demanding: prayer. He prayed, "But Lord, I must confess that I'm weak now. I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage. Now I'm afraid. And I can't let the people see me like this, because if they see me weak and losing my courage, they will begin to get weak." King knew that a leader can no longer be leader or give courage to others if he does not look like he believes in what he says. Just as strength can be contagious, so can weakness. So he prayed with this in mind. He just gave it all to God, all alone in his kitchen, saying that he needed strength. He said that he heard a voice say to him, "Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and lo, I will be with you, even until the end of the world." Before praying, King was a man with heavy responsibilities and who may have been on the verge of giving up. After praying, King was a man with conviction who would not give up. And even a few days later, when someone planted a bomb near his home, King was the first one to calm things down by saying, "We are not advocating violence. We want to love our enemies."
These anonymous death threats were just a drop in an ocean of violence. On a daily basis, the Black community heard speeches expressing hatred, humiliation, and racism. Black murders were not investigated by the police, which reinforced a sense of injustice that was already well entrenched. Then, when 4 innocent girls were victims of a bomb attack in a church, the tension in the community intensified. Yet, faced with this escalation of violence, King decided to turn the other cheek.
I believe that non-violence is first and foremost a state of mind. With a non-violent attitude, the right strategies come forth. For King, as with Gandhi, this state of mind came first. In any case, King, along with many others who had already been initiated in non-violent action, would lead or join other major events.
Martin Luther King was going from city to city, town to town, preaching and advocating nonviolence. And people began to listen, to say he is correct. Because most people in the South are Baptists, they're church-going people, okay? We believe in God. And we never learned in church that violence was good, only that it is no good for anyone.
Mais il ne faudra jamais oublier qu'en amont, il y a des heures.
But we must never forget that beforehand, there are many hours spent praying, singing, and meditating in church. This can be done within a community, but it can also be done personally and at home. Engaging in this foundational activity before taking action is crucial. And then, naturally, there is also the issue of whether the other person is an enemy to be defeated or a brother who is blind. Indeed, they are not at all the same. Because basically, if he is a brother who is blind, and I'm talking about the white man who supports segregation, that means that, deep down, he is like the black man in his acceptance of segregation. That is, segregation has distorted his worldview and his outlook on other people. So, what must be combated is what distorts the point of view of the persons who impose segregation on black people and try to make black people believe that they are subhuman.
cette ségrégation, le fait qu'il soit considéré comme un sous-homme.
Quand il y a une agression,
when someone is aggressive with me, when I'm aggressed, naturally I have to react and I become aggressive. If someone is treating me badly, it seems normal that I don't just sit there and take it without saying anything. There's obviously a problem. So there are three options here. Firstly, I can respond by being aggressive. That is to say, someone attacks me and I attack them back in a tit-for-tat, but this can gradually ramp up the level of aggression. The second option is to endure the insults. Because the other is stronger than me, because I don't want to attack him or her, or because it's just the way I do things. So when someone attacks me and I just stay peaceful, I don't do anything, I just put up with it. But when I swallow this aggression inside of me, it gradually turns into depression. That is when I always take the blows and insults without reacting. I become depressed and I lose my drive. It is very interesting that Martin Luther King could see this in the people of color of his country because they were always swallowing insults. And he could see that they were losing their dignity and that they had to react. The way out is what is known in a special language as benign aggression, as opposed to malignant aggression. This means that I hit back at the other person, but in a benign way. I react in a way that does not ignore the other's existence. For example, to the one who strikes me on the left cheek, I offer him the other cheek, or to the one who takes my coat, I give him my shirt as well. That is to say, I do something to him that goes beyond being spiteful. Something that demonstrates my dignity and goodness, and at that moment, the other has the option to react as well.
So
the other person is not the enemy, but rather a brother. This is something we actually discover by struggling with or opposing this brother. In spite of all this, it is very important to discover that this other person is worth just as much as me. So there is a lot of work to do, which is not just strategic. That is to say, combined with saying, do this, do that, or take such and such a step, there is also work to do, which I would call profoundly spiritual.
There were some people who convinced King that in order for the activists to be capable of facing violence in a non-violent manner, they needed to be trained. So then training sessions were held, in which again the spiritual dimension was often very strong, especially when they took place in the black churches. And there was a lot of teaching about self-discipline and about how to handle being attacked while not being overcome by anger, hatred, or fear. Jesus was the greatest non-violent person. That's crystal clear. He never wanted to destroy anyone. He never had a desire to destroy anyone. He didn't want to force anyone to do anything. He left people free to decide what they wanted to believe. There is a large degree of freedom in the practice of non-violence. That is, wanting others to be really free to say and believe whatever they want. And Jesus, this is another point about non-violence which might be difficult for us to affirm. Suffering, when lived in dignity, has a capacity to purify. That's the idea.
In 1964, President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which put an end to segregation against the black community. Despite this, the state of Alabama managed to block black people from registering to vote. Martin Luther King, who had received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, called for a march which would lead the demonstrators from Selma to Montgomery, where the local government headquarters was based. The first attempt took place on March 7, 1965. It was a total failure. The local police attacked and wounded several protesters. This violence created an uproar all over the country. Then, on March 21st, they undertook a second march, which lasted several days. Mary Odoms is originally from Monrovia, Alabama. During her childhood, she took part in the Selma March with her family.
My family heard about the march right? It's a very small farming town. So everyone meet in the church and everyone discuss the march. So everyone that could go on the march would go. They would travel by car, bus, or some would walk, try to walk. But everyone who was well enough and young enough would participate. So my parents and some of my brothers and sisters went. There are 9 children in my family, and only 7 of us went on the march. We were all afraid. I think even the grown-ups were afraid because we did not know what was going to happen or when it was going to happen. There was always the Ku Klux Klan and other racist organizations who did not want this or permit this. And they would try to attack people along the way and beat them up, everything. It is very important that the younger people today know these things. So they will know what we have been through. They would know what Afro-Americans in USA fought for: the right to vote, the right to attend schools with other children, other nationalities, the right to attend whatever church you want to, and the right to attend a college or university. Before, we had none of those things, none of those options. And there was nothing that we could do about it. It is always a memory when you go to vote.
Guadeloupe, a French department and overseas region, is situated in the West Indies and has about 400,000 inhabitants, 80% of whom are descended from slaves. For the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King, the Agape Association in Guadeloupe organized a conference entitled, "Together, Let Us Build the Guadeloupe Society," to see how Martin Luther King's message can be inspiring and relevant today in a post-slavery society.
The idea of organizing this conference was that Martin Luther King was an emblematic figure because he was black, he was a Christian, he was a man who had a dream, and many people from Guadeloupe see themselves in those traits. It should be noted that Guadeloupe is a former colony, a French département which came out of the slave trade and colonization. And problems of identity, race, and racism are significant in Guadeloupe.
There are 2 things that I share with Martin Luther King. Firstly, this universal dimension of the gospel message. As he says, there is in Christianity a broad universalism that allows us to refuse and to reject racism, both theoretically and practically. And the other thing that I share with him is a love for my country and my people who have painful memories of the past and who are searching for their identity. So I work to heal and to transform memories. I work to bring about reconciliation.
The psychological and sociological traumas associated with slavery and the slave trade have not been wiped out and continue to be part of relationships and to blur identities. Delinquency, family violence, and murder rates keep climbing. Unemployment affects 30% of the population and 50% of young people. To lower these rates and to build the Guadeloupe of tomorrow, It's necessary to build an atmosphere of attentive listening and dialogue where everyone can participate. The future of the Caribbean and Central America depends on using new and innovative strategies which highlight the talents of the local inhabitants and the value of local resources.
Guadeloupe is in fact a département with much violence. It is often in the news. I believe that teaching the practice of non-violence, whether for individuals or on a political level, is really essential today.
We need it because in Guadeloupe, we're becoming more sectarian and more focused on the individual. Our communities live in peace, but only because they never meet. So Martin Luther King's message makes sense for us, more than for the African Americans at the time. We should use nonviolence, but we should also communicate amongst ourselves.
We should do everything possible to build a society that does not enable violence. And we should do this in ways that are good, noble and caring. I have been involved in certain campaigns or with certain organizations where we have traveled around the country saying no to violence, no to substance abuse, and no to degrading treatment of women. So this is something very real to me. This non-violence is not only philosophical. I also try to prevent violence in a way that young people can envisage life in Guadeloupe being built without violence.
Martin Luther King believed that to achieve peace, we have to use peaceful means. I often see in Guadeloupe, too, that we want to have peaceful solutions because people live together, but we think that we have to use violent means to get there. So we take up arms. If we look around us, what do we see? That there is no end to violence, that it leads to more violence, because children who lose their father or their mother, or women who lose their children, just keep hurting in their hearts.
We must educate with love, educate and communicate with love, love that we have for ourselves and also for others. Because if we ourselves are nonviolent, if we know how to control ourselves, we can have better relationships with others without violence. We need reconciliation, be it in a couple's relationship or in daily life. We need to be close and to become closer, to listen and to understand, to see each other, and to look and, when needed, ask for forgiveness.
The greatness of a country does not depend on its area, but on the heart of its inhabitants. We say we have a heart that is generous. Well, I would love it if this generosity would lead to reconciliation.
One saying of Martin Luther King which inspires me is, "We must live together as brothers, or we will die together as fools." And I think that this is really a message of unity and fraternity which is still relevant today.
From the Gospel of St. Matthew. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. Lord, thank you for all the men and women who promote nonviolent communication and methods in Guadeloupe, the United States, and throughout the world. When we are faced with injustice and filled with revolt, we pray that you will bring peace to our hearts, that you will show us how to communicate with others, and that your Holy Spirit will lead us to commit ourselves personally and collectively to nonviolence. We pray that Martin Luther King's dream be fulfilled and that we all become sisters and brothers.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. 10,000 years, bright shining is the sun. I've no less days to sing